After the end of World War II in 1945, Germany lay in ruins, and the victorious Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France, divided the defeated nation into 4 occupation zones. Berlin, although located deep within the Soviet zone of Eastern Germany, was also divided into 4 sectors, each controlled by one of the Allies. Initially, this arrangement was meant to be temporary, but growing tensions between the Western powers and the Soviet Union soon turned Berlin into the symbolic and physical center of the emerging Cold War. The ideological divide between capitalism and communism quickly became evident. While the Western sectors, administered by the United States, Britain, and France, began rebuilding along democratic and capitalist lines, the Soviet sector established a communist government aligned with Moscow. The growing disparity in living standards, freedoms, and political systems created deep resentment and instability. In 1948, when the Soviets attempted to force the Western Allies out of Berlin by blocking all land access to the city, the Western powers responded with the Berlin Airlift, an extraordinary operation that supplied West Berlin entirely by air for nearly a year. The blockade failed, but it demonstrated how crucial Berlin had become in the struggle between East and West. In 1949, Germany was formally divided into 2 states: the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, in the west, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, in the east. Berlin, though located entirely within East German territory, remained similarly divided into West Berlin and East Berlin. West Berlin became a prosperous enclave of freedom and democracy, surrounded by the communist East. For many East Germans unhappy with life under the Soviet-backed regime, Berlin became the escape route to the West. Between 1949 and 1961, more than 2.5 million East Germans fled through Berlin, seeking a better life in the West. This massive exodus threatened the very stability of East Germany, both economically and politically, as it lost skilled workers, professionals, and young citizens. To stop this, the East German government, with Soviet approval, decided to close the border permanently. In the early hours of August 13, 1961, soldiers and workers began constructing what would become one of the most infamous symbols of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall. Barbed wire barriers went up overnight, later replaced by a concrete wall that would stretch over 155 kilometers, completely encircling West Berlin. Streets were cut in half, families were separated, and neighborhoods divided. The wall was heavily guarded with watchtowers, minefields, and the so-called death strip, a no-man's land where anyone attempting to cross risked being shot. Over the years, many tried to escape. Some succeeded through tunnels, hidden compartments in vehicles, or daring flights over the barrier, but more than 100 people lost their lives trying to cross. For the next 28 years, the wall stood as the most potent symbol of the division between East and West, between freedom and oppression. Despite the East German regime's attempts to present the wall as a protective barrier against Western influence, it was clear to the world that it was meant to imprison its own citizens. West Berlin, meanwhile, became a showcase of Western prosperity and democracy, attracting global attention and support. Visits by figures such as U.S. President John F. Kennedy, who in 1963 famously declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner," and Ronald Reagan, who in 1987 urged, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," underscored its symbolic role in the global confrontation between the 2 systems. Over time, however, the political and economic stagnation of East Germany, coupled with growing dissent and the reformist policies of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, began to undermine the communist bloc. By 1989, the winds of change were sweeping through Eastern Europe. Peaceful revolutions were toppling communist governments across the continent, and East Germans began protesting in massive numbers for freedom of movement and democratic reforms. Facing mounting pressure, the East German government unexpectedly announced on November 9, 1989, that citizens could cross the border freely. Crowds of East Berliners surged toward the checkpoints, and border guards, overwhelmed and unsure how to respond, opened the gates. That night, thousands climbed onto the wall, cheering, crying, and chipping away at it with hammers and picks. The world watched in awe as families reunited and the once heavily guarded barrier crumbled before their eyes. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked the beginning of the end for communist rule in Eastern Europe and symbolized the triumph of freedom over division. Within a year, Germany was officially reunified on October 3, 1990, ending decades of separation. Today, only fragments of the wall remain, preserved as memorials to remind future generations of the costs of ideological division and the enduring human desire for unity and liberty. The 28 years of Berlin's division remain one of the most dramatic chapters in modern history, encapsulating the struggles, fears, and hopes of an entire era defined by the Cold War.